Japan welcomed global leaders at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park on this Friday, which marks the first day of the G7 gathering that addresses, among other issues, Russia's invasion of Ukraine this afternoon. So what role does South Korea hope to play at this latest G7 summit? What are the implications of this year's G7 agenda on current geopolitical tensions? And how have trilateral talks affected tensions on the Korean Peninsula? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Global leaders are gathered in Hiroshima, Japan to address a host of geopolitical challenges, economic concerns and, of course, climate change. For more on this, I have Professor Chung Kuyoun at Kangwon National University live on the line. Professor Chung, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I also have Dr. Stephen Noerper, the head of Asia Dialogue over in Hawaii, live on the line as well. Dr. Noerper, welcome back.
Thank you. Delighted to be back.
Right, Dr. Noerper, there have been a bit of reports, a number of reports that is, about the prospects of a G8 framework, including South Korea as an official member. Let's start off with your thoughts regarding this particular speculation.
Well, it's interesting, especially as Korea grows its economy from the 10th to the 9th largest in the world. There are 7 additional countries at this G7, the formal G7, Korea and 6 others. But it says a lot about where Korea has gone. And it says a lot about Korea's global pivotal role and how it's emerging as not only an economic, but as a politically relevant player in the region, but also globally. So it is a real step up in Korean diplomacy and something that's quite notable. It also happens in the context of real improvement of late politically in the relations between Japan and Korea, better coordination among the United States, Korea, and Japan, and clearly a lot of common concerns about China, about Ukraine. And so the international impetus makes it important that Korea be there, and it shows Korea in a very positive light.
Right, and talking about Korea's role, Dr. Noerper, addressing a joint session of the U.S. Congress during his state visit to the U.S., President Yoon Suk Yeol pledged that Korea would play a global part, one that matches its economic capacity. What are the prospects of this particular pledge?
Oh, quite important, because Korea, especially in the reconnection in the region with Japan, is diversifying the supply chain. And there's been a lot of international concern relative to China in that regard. So it creates a better atmosphere for Korean business to grow, especially in sectors like technology. It helps Korea-United States relations. Since 2021, Korea has been the largest foreign investor in the United States, the largest provider of FDI. And so that's quite significant too. And it shows a real impact in terms of not only investment by dollars, but in terms of investment in U.S. jobs. So that's very important for its most critical ally, the United States, and it's good for Korea. So it really presents an opportunity where Korea is rising, showing not only economic might, but political and cultural import that go hand in hand with it. And again, makes it such a pivotal player in the regional and international arena, and speaks very kindly to prospects for Korean leadership going forward regionally and globally.
Right, and keeping in mind what Dr. Noerper has just said, Professor Chung, what role do you suppose does South Korea look to play at this particular G7 summit over in neighboring Japan?
Well, South Korea is not an official member of G7, as Noerper mentions, but is able to join this time. President Yoon Suk Yeol will probably hold bilateral meetings and a number of trilateral and multilateral meetings as well. So given that G7 summit is between like-minded countries who share their views and interests in sustaining rules-based orders, it allows South Korea to understand how these leading countries will resolve the current pending issues, such as Ukraine and Taiwan Strait, as well as advanced technology issue and supply chain issue. It is a great opportunity for South Korea to show its presence in addressing this issue and voice their opinions over them. By doing so, as Noerper mentions, South Korea's kind of foreign policy visions of global pivotal states can be actually realized. It can find more opportunities to serve its regional and global role and contribute to the regional stability and prosperity, not only because it has the capacity, but also it has a willingness to serve that role. Especially South Korea wants to garner support for its North Korea policy as well as like deterrence and sanctions, as well as dissuasion conditions among the participants and find a way to more coordinate in a seamless way.
Right. Dr. Noerper, economic security and, of course, the broader global security, as Professor Chung mentioned, are poised for top talks at the G7 summit this time around. What do you suppose are the implications of this agenda amid the current geopolitical tensions?
It's a great question, Sunhee, because this is the most important G7 relative to geopolitical tensions. Originally, the G7 was really catalyzed around economic issues, but as issues of political security and economic security have blossomed and are very much interrelated, it clearly has taken on import. It's taken on import in terms of very specific challenges, things like supply chain diversification, technological cooperation in areas where Korea has great advantage, like semiconductors, and where Japan, too, shares with Korea interests and both supply one another. In terms of other types of economic opportunities, alternative energy, electric vehicles, etc. And it's very important in terms of the geopolitical aspect, concern about Ukraine, concern about Taiwan, as Professor Chung has just mentioned, and trying to find common balance among these democratic nations that are concerned about countries like China, Russia, and the DPRK, and the challenges that they present to a free, liberal, democratic world and to liberal economic models.
Right, and that being said, Professor Chung, do you expect a fresh unified message by the G7 with regard to China's assertive foreign policy and, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I don't think it's going to be fresh, but there will be a unified message. I just checked out the news that President Zelensky will join the G7 summit in person. He just arrived in Japan. So I think this will strengthen the spirit among those 7 countries to criticize revisionist actions of Russia and Ukraine. And Taiwan's trade issue, I think this will be discussed as well. Just before the G7 meeting, Britain and Japan came up with Hiroshima Consensus, which agrees to send aircraft carriers to East China Sea and South China Sea from UK side, which is the second time since 2021, to send a clear signal that China to stay in the rule-based order. So I expect this types of message among 7 countries will circulate across the summit.
And keeping in mind what Professor Chung has just said, Dr. Noerper, what kind of response do you envision from China and Russia, of course, in the case of a united G7 stance on matters that the 2 countries, of course, consider to be of national interest, such as the situation surrounding the Taiwan Strait and, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine?
Well, clearly, we're in a situation where we have these evolving blocks with countries like South Korea, Japan, and the United States, alongside Australia, New Zealand, India, and others in one faction. And we have China, Russia, the DPRK in another. The concern is that countries like China and Russia are pursuing not only a liberal democracy, but checks on fairness economically and otherwise. And clearly, the war in Ukraine is the most fundamental war and peace issue of the 21st century. And how that is finished, how that is stemmed, will certainly affect the way that China is thinking about issues like Taiwan. It's important to remember that at the same time that the G7 meeting is going on, Xi Jinping of China has just had Central Asian nation leaders together for a summit, which shows you both their interest in access through the old Silk Road, as well as actually offsetting Russia, because that is traditionally Russia's sphere of influence. So there's a lot going on in terms of the international arena and the changing dynamics, and clearly that makes this G7 particularly important, and Korea's presence at it very important as well.
Meanwhile, Professor Chung, trilateral talks among South Korea, Japan and the US took place in November in Cambodia, and the next such interaction hopefully will take place this coming Sunday. That being said, how do you evaluate the security situation here on the Korean Peninsula over the past 6 months?
Well, as Dr. Noerper just mentions, US and China competitions are getting stronger. And also Korean Peninsula is not an exception. So North Korea is not talking to anyone in the region, not only South Korea, but also United States, while its tactical alignment with China and Russia becomes more salient. Also, North Korea announced yesterday that it had completed preparation for loading the first military reconnaissance satellite, which is projectile, I guess. So I don't think the security situation in the Korean Peninsula is not getting better. And China further criticized Washington declarations between U.S. and South Korea last month. So overall, this hostile environment gave more reason for South Korea, U.S., and Japan to cooperate more than in the past.
And I extend the same question to you, Dr. Noerper. What are your thoughts regarding the status of security here on the peninsula over the past 6 months?
They've become much more concerning, whereas for 70 years we've had a situation of relative stability. The heated words on both sides of the DMZ have raised concern. The fact that the DPRK has tested so frequently and has shown real improvements in terms of their military technology means that the opportunity for mishap, miscalculation, misunderstanding only increases. And that's what I'm most concerned about, not a direct state challenge, but really the type of mishap that could occur amidst this testing or amidst a nuclear test. And so we need to be concerned about that. So while it's very good that the United States, Korea, and Japan have enhanced trilateral coordination and cooperation, we need to think much more creatively about the challenges like nuclear safety, like creating a more stable environment that complements the situation, and creative ways to bring the DPRK to the negotiating table. And also, are there ways to have China and Russia contribute in more positive ways for the peninsula, despite these concerns about an emerging bloc and more hostile relations between the United States and China? So hopefully we can write that to create a level and more steady voyage as we proceed with regional relations. But it does take a very careful look at the very real risks that have increased the last 6 months. And that behooves us all to, again, think creatively and try to find new solutions and join new dialogue.
Right. Professor Chung, some say the upcoming trilateral talks will seek to set up an early warning system to North Korea's nuclear and missile threats through strategic sharing of intelligence. What is the significance, you suppose, of such a setup?
I think this issue has been raised last year during the Phnom Penh Declaration and also discussed last April during the trilateral defense meetings. And 3 countries actually discussed on how to make the most of the existing system, which is trilateral information sharing agreement to share missile warning information launched by North Korea in real time. And I think this issue will be concluded during the Shangri-La dialogue in coming June. So the thing is that in order to respond to the North Korea's missile provocation, the main issue is how quickly it can actually detect and track them in the first place. But individual approach, by Japan, South Korea, and United States has only its limitations. So real-time sharing of missile warnings information among 3 countries to share command and control system, such as radars operated by the Joint Chief of Staffs, USFK, Japan Self-Defense Forces, and so forth and so on. So through the medium of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. So this setup means that 3 countries' effort to respond to North Korea's threat is more integrated than in the past and take a more consistent response toward the North and beyond, especially toward the China as well.
Dr. Noerper, others say such active initiatives among the 3 countries, namely, of course, South Korea, the U.S., and Japan, will lead to greater tangible support for North Korea from Russia and China. What do you say?
Well, it's likely in the context of these increasing blocs. And while it's good, as Professor Chung has just said, that we've had enhanced capabilities and cooperation on the trilateral level, things that make a real difference in terms of our tracking, our monitoring, and of course the greater issue of extended deterrence, that will lead China, Russia, and the DPRK to think about their own relations and their own preparations. So you will see continued joint exercises between Russia and China. A lot of it will be oriented at trying to find ways to counterweight the United States and its influence in the region. And of course, they will both look at the DPRK for opportunities, certainly not enforcing sanctions and taking a softer view in the United Nations. Were North Korea to test nuclear right now, it would be very hard to get resolutions through the Security Council because of 2 of the P5 members, China and Russia, objecting to that. So it really will take us all kind of working to strike at better consensus to counter those realities. It's a fairly dark picture But if we can think creatively and try to find ways to engage all of the players in regional fora through the imprimatur of the United Nations, that's really necessary to strike at a more stable balance in Northeast Asia and for the Korean Peninsula.
Right. Professor Chung, and do feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears like the South Korean administration, the Yoon administration that would be, has been adopting clarity in its foreign policy strategy. Do you see this stance as ultimately serving in favor of South Korea as a whole?
Well, the current Yoon administration took the stance of strategic clarity for many reasons, actually. First, it identifies itself as a liberal democracy, which developed under the current rules-based order. And second, related to this point is that China, Russia, and North Korea is perceived as revisionist countries who do not comply with the current order with different incompatible political system and ideology. Furthermore, against this backdrop, South Korea taking an accommodative stance toward China during the previous Moon administrations, which makes South Korea regarded as a weak link among the like-minded countries coalition, especially between U.S. and Japan, which not only weakened the leverage of South Korea vis-a-vis the North and China, and weakened the coalition of the like-minded countries. So this understanding has made South Korea to took a strategic clarity positions under the current Yoon administrations. And it has been assessed that during the previous administration's stance, which take a strategic less clarity, has not made South Korea's security less getting better. So given that revisionist countries' coalitions are getting serious, I think South Korea's position on this strategic clarity serves its interest so far.
And Dr. Noerper, what are your thoughts? Do you believe Korea's shift to strategic clarity is in its best interests?
Well, it's from a foreign policy perspective, a balance. And there's always a back and forth between strategic clarity and a certain level of strategic ambiguity. And that strategic ambiguity, has surrounded things like U.S. policy on Taiwan, for example. But the clarity in and of itself is perfectly fine. It does show a transparency. It does make it very clear what the implications are for things like DPRK enhancements and testing. That said, there needs to be allowances made and a certain strategic cushion employed so that clarity doesn't mean a ratcheting up of the war of words or some type of escalation. And to counter that escalatory nature is very important. So clarity is good, and we want that in terms of clear communications. But again, we need to combine that with some creative thinking and ways to get people to the negotiating table so that we can counter the types of technological enhancements that the DPRK has made in a rather short time, and that we can counter the concerns and effects of a seventh nuclear test, and that we can show both a common demeanor by way of common democracies, as well as security coordination and longer-term concerns relative to China.
Right, and talking about China, of course, this is an impromptu question, but Professor Chung, do you believe that in the case of a violent confrontation between China and Taiwan, would South Korea be drawn into the conflict, do you think? Speaking entirely within your capacity as a scholar, of course.
Well, it depends on what kind of parameters China actually thinking about in terms of invading Taiwan, if it actually happens. We can think of many different types of scenarios when it comes to Taiwan contingency, but South Korea began to think that we cannot just avoid the situation 100%. Given that South Korea is an ally of the United States, and also we are kind of beginning trilateral cooperations, we cannot but involved into this Taiwan contingency if any types of contingency ever happens. But we also think about what kind of consequences can happen to Korean Peninsula because we have North Korea. North Korea might take advantage of these contingency situations to kind of conduct a more opportunistic behavior, like with or without acquiescence of China. So basically, we have to think about what could happen in the Korean Peninsula perimeters if that contingency ever happened.
Right, and hopefully it will not, of course. Dr. Noerper, in recent times, quite recently though, quite a number of US scholars have talked about the possibility of a confrontation between China and the US as well. Now, others have pointed to that scenario being highly unlikely. quoting, of course, the recent talks between U.S. officials and their Chinese counterparts over in Vienna, closed-door confrontations, closed-door negotiations, of course. What are your thoughts with regard to prospects of an outright confrontation between the U.S. and China?
Well, I hope those prospects are not likely. And there is always the room, again, for mistaken messages, and we really don't know what Xi and the court in Beijing ultimately will decide. However, what we hope is that they realize, especially in looking at Ukraine, that the lesson has been the dramatic deterioration of the Russian economy, the entire European and Asian front having turned against Russia, the effect of sanctions, and really more importantly, the withdrawal of business and the follow-on effects. That's incredibly important because it shows China how costly misadventure would be for them. And it shows them that indeed the cause of peace and cooperation is much more important. To that end, South Korea is quite important because China relies on it and needs it for investment, for managerial expertise, for insight. And there are cooperative aspects, whether it's on EVs, on health, and other issues that we should be looking at in terms of the complex. So not to demonize China, but to find ways to promote responsible Chinese leadership. So we need to be concerned about that with the evolution of these blocs and try to find ways to make these regional mechanisms more dependent and exemplary by way of trade cooperation, technological exchange, environmental considerations, and less military in nature, because we don't want that to be blown out of proportion.
Professor Chung, one final question to you, a very brief one. In recent times, there have also been talk about a potential new Quad arrangement between South Korea, Japan, the US, and Canada. What are your thoughts regarding this potential arrangement?
Well, I think Canada actually raised the possibility about a new Quad, including Canada and South Korea. I think it is kind of a trend that a number of countries are suggesting number of multilateral cooperation formats. So I think Canada's suggestion can be understood in this way. But the thing is, what's the purpose of having this quadrilateral kind of format coordinations if that actually occurs? Whether it is kind of targeting North Korea or whether it is targeting China, I think we have to think about what's the kind of purpose of that multilateral cooperation for.
Right, of course, I see. All right, Professor Chung, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Dr. Noerper over in Hawaii, thank you very much for your insights today.
Aloha and thank you.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we end this week's editions of Issues and Insiders. Have a great weekend and see you same time next Monday.